I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. A San Antonio man who confessed to being a serial killer has been sentenced to 2 life terms in the rape and strangulation deaths of 5 women. And I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala to get the latest details on the case. So, Liz, as always, great to have you here on the program. Let's start with a look at the victims in this case. 5 women ranging from 15 to 46 years of age.
Yes, this is a case actually, Chance, that several of us have been following in the newsroom on the crime beat for several years. He is a really interesting story for many reasons. It's just tragic for all of the people that he has admitted now to killing. The one that really brought our attention to this case was when the body of Natalie Chavez was found under the Veracruz Street Bridge over Apache Creek on the city's west side in December of 2014. She was a 15-year-old. She had been a runaway, and it was a horrific thing because she was found and obviously had been attacked. And so it began this thing where we were just constantly checking to see how this could have happened. So when Avalos was arrested in 2015, things kind of started turning in that case. And police and other investigators were able to link him to the crime. And not only that case, but also for 4 other women by DNA, because there had been DNA that had been left either on the victim or at the scene. And with the national database, the officers were able to connect the dots that he was actually connected to all of these crimes.
And so 32-year-old Johnny Joe Avalos was arrested in April 2015, connected to, as you mentioned, 15-year-old Natalie Chavez. As the case moved forward, police started connecting the dots, and former Bexar County District Attorney Nico LaHood, he initially pursued the death penalty against Avalos, but then dropped it after the man's mental capacity was challenged. Now, I believe Avalos has been described as being intellectually disabled, but also I believe he was found to be competent to stand trial. That would stand to reason. He's been sentenced now. If he was competent, I'm wondering why the death penalty was taken off the table.
Well, the way it was explained to me by the prosecutor, well, first of all, we should back up and just talk a little bit about competency again, because it's something that I actually have to also look up whenever it arises, because competency and insanity many times are confused for the same thing. So, according to law, people in law, and also a good resource, I'm actually going to cite something from Psychology Today that I read during some of my research, that you can raise a competency issue. The actual person can raise it, or the lawyers in the case, or even based on a judge's observation, because they need to be able to understand exactly what's going on with your case. They need to be able to help their attorneys, with information. They need to be able to understand what sort of pleas could come, to the table from the side of, the prosecutors. So, it's important for them to be able to, I guess, pass an evaluation with, 2 different parties to be able to understand. And, we actually touched on this last week in the Janine Jones case as well, because she was actually found competent, but her attorney challenged it. So now she's going to go back through the process to be evaluated on that. But in this particular case, when you're talking about sending someone to death row, you know, my understanding is you can be competent to stand trial. You can understand these things, but when it comes down to actually, you know, I would say, just in my observations, when it comes to arguing the case, if you were to go to trial on something like this and argue it to a jury, you know, there's a real big chance that they're not going to want to send somebody who is mentally deficient in some way to death row. I mean, it's not, you know, there are people who it's not constitutional, um, and it's not a good look, really. You know, you see these cases pop up across the nation all the time that so and so is insane, or they are mentally disabled in some way, going to death row. I mean, sometimes it happens, but as far as it's not happening right now in Bexar County. So there have been other cases also where actually people have been found to be insane, and they just don't do that. They're not going to send somebody who's mentally deficient to death row.
Thinking once again about the victims, authorities have said that most of these women had engaged in prostitution in neighborhoods where Avalos lived. So, you know, do the police have any theories as to why these women were targeted?
Well, actually, it's more of, at this particular juncture, in speaking with the prosecutor, David Lunan, uh, all of them, yes, the ones that Avalos admitted that he killed, 4 of the 5 were known to be prostitutes. So one of the things that was interesting in this case, or these cases rather, is that Johnny Joe Avalos lived on the South Side. A lot of he worked. I believe he might have been a busboy for a restaurant over on on the South Side of San Antonio. That's where a lot of his victims were actually found. Natalie Chavez actually was found on the West Side. One of the things that David Lunan said to media following the sentencing was that Johnny Joe Avalos would actually prowl the streets of the West Side and the South Side. Now, when you're talking about prostitution, it's a situation where somebody's going to walk up to somebody and they're going to offer them money. So, the idea here is that that's probably what he did. He would approach these women, he would offer them money to have sex, and he would isolate them and strangle them. And we were told that he would have sex with their dead bodies. So, you know, they were able, we'll go back to that DNA thing that you asked about earlier. When, they started getting all of these victims, and they, were noticing that they were, found on the South Side. I mean, this was a really horrible thing. I mean, these women were found, either in vacant lots, in a parking lot, under a bridge, on the sidewalk in a neighborhood. But there were things that occurred there. They found, DNA on the victims, and there was one instance where actually the defendant's pair of boxer shorts was actually left at a scene. So they were, able to pull all of that together. And and I've got to say, you raise you know the word victim here. We should probably talk about some of these other women. The other victims were Rosemary Bettis. She was 28 years old, and she was found in January of 2015. Genevieve Ramirez was 46. She was found in March of 2015. And Celia Lopez was 29, and she was found in April of 2015. But there was a killing that occurred in October of 2012. A woman by the name of Vanessa Lopez, and she was 25 years old also. Now she was killed over on the west side, close to the near downtown area, and her body was dumped in San Pedro Creek. But with a series of storms that we had, she wasn't found until later, and her body actually was on the south side at Espada Dam. So it took, a while to link that death to Johnny Joe Avalos, but that actually happened 4 years later in 2016. So, there was a gulf there, but there's absolutely no way of knowing exactly why these women were targeted. It's just an unfortunate situation with what happened to them. It's tragic, but also, the fact that a 15-year-old runaway got swept up into this whole thing as well, but why he did these things. Actually, I would like to talk to him. I'm sure that it's going to take a while before that can occur, but that would be a question that I would ask Johnny Joe Avalos.
We've already covered a bit of, the whole idea of why the death penalty was not on the table. I thought you did a great job of explaining that. But more about that, we've talked about in the past, a life sentence often does not mean life. But here, 2 life sentences, they'll be served at the same time. And I believe that includes no possibility of parole. So that means zero chance Avalos will ever be out of prison, correct?
Yes, this is correct, and this is entirely because of the state of Texas. You know, capital murder is an offense that is punishable by death or life without the possibility of parole. So, in this particular case, he obviously was not uh, going to be sent to death row because of his mental capacity. So, in this particular case, there were 2 counts, 2 murder counts, but in both of those counts, you have one count that it was for 2 of the victims, and then the other count was for the other 3. So those are 2 life without the possibility of parole sentences. So whenever I say things like life sentence in Texas is 60 years, it really doesn't apply here because the only other option for him would have been to be put to death. So since that can't happen, he will he was sentenced to 2 life sentences that will be served at the same time. But as you said, there is zero chance that he will ever be let out of prison.
And then time for final thoughts here, Elizabeth, as we wrap up today's episode. You've already mentioned you're not a lawyer, you're a reporter, I'm not a lawyer. So, as a layperson, it seems to me that there's an obvious use of the term serial killer here, but that's actually something that didn't come up much for this case. Why do you think that's what happened?
This is a very interesting question. And when, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, we've been following this case for a really long time. And when we started seeing that the victim list was increasing, that was the first question for us was is when are the words serial killer going to be used in this case? But my understanding on this, as a young, and I'll say young, not for my age, but a youth in a field where I'm dealing with law, which I've never studied in my life. Serial killer isn't really like it's not a legal term. You know, the FBI will define it loosely that there there are multiple victims, more than 3 maybe. But the FBI wasn't ever involved in this case. And San Antonio police never identified him as such. The first time this started coming up was as more victims were starting to be found, but it was more of a situation where it was a speculative type of thing. I know that one of my colleagues, Bruce Selcraig, wrote one of the stories when we knew that Johnny Joe Avalos had possibly 4 victims. So, but there have been some serial killers in San Antonio or tied to San Antonio or in South Texas over the years. A few of those cases stand out. We spoke last week about Janine Jones, known as the Angel of Death. Even though she's only been convicted of killing one person, she's believed to be responsible for the deaths of at least 40 to up to 60 children. And as you know, she's awaiting trial on 5 new murder charges of San Antonio children in the 1980s. And then there was a serial killer named Tommy Lynn Sells. He was a drifter who was tied to the killings of more than a dozen people, including a 9-year-old San Antonio girl. He was executed in April of 2014. He was sent to death row in 2000 for the killing of a 13-year-old in Del Rio. Her name was Mary Beatrice Bettis, and she had actually been abducted from a fiesta event at Market Square in 1999. He is tied to, like I said, the killing of more than a dozen people. And then in September, down by Laredo, a Border Patrol agent who had been with the agency for 10 years was arrested and charged in the deaths of 4 people and for trying to kill a 5th person who actually lived, and all of that in less than 2 weeks. And he pleaded not guilty to capital murder and is awaiting trial in Webb County, where the district attorney there is seeking the death penalty. So, for me, it's, as somebody who watches a lot of crime shows and follows a lot of these types of killings, that was a question, why didn't we do it that way? But I just think the bottom line is that I think that a lot of these unless the FBI is involved, I think, your local law enforcement agencies just really kind of want to get in court and want to, bring justice to the victims in the cases.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.